The Alpha King of Veldemere had never lost an argument in the council hall, mostly because no one dared finish one with him. So when James Ashwood declared, in front of 11 bored nobles and one very awake master of the Exchequer, that raising wolf pups required no more skill than housebreaking a dog, he expected silence. He got William Hart instead. Will had come to the palace that morning, only to deliver a request for emergency roof repairs, the third such request in as many months, and he arrived at the council chamber door in time to hear his life's work reduced to a joke about dogs. "Say that again," Will said. "Somewhere the children can't hear you agreeing with yourself." 12 heads turned, the king's included. He was younger than Will expected a king to be, dark-haired, broad through the shoulders in the way of alphas, who had spent more years holding a sword than a scepter, and entirely unused to being interrupted by an omega in a flour-dusted coat. For a moment something almost like amusement crossed his face, quickly smoothed into royal composure. "You disagree, caretaker." "I run a nursery for 12 unpredictable young shifters with a leaking roof and half a budget," Will said. "I invite your majesty to disagree with me, from inside it. 7 days. If pups are so easy, prove it. If you fail, Thistledown gets its funding without another lecture about frugality." He hadn't meant to say it. It had simply arrived, the way honesty sometimes does when a person is tired and underfunded and has just watched a king call his children dogs. The council chamber went very still. Sir Percival Grey, master of the Exchequer, looked as though Christmas had come early. A public humiliation of the king's pride would make for excellent leverage at next quarter's budget meeting, whichever way it went. James Ashwood studied Will for a long moment. Whatever he saw in the caretaker's face, stubbornness, exhaustion, the particular fire of someone who has run out of patience for being underestimated, seemed to settle something in him. 7 days, the king agreed. "Prepare a schedule. Prepare a will," Sir Percival murmured, not quietly enough. The Alpha King entered Thistledown Nursery at 10 o'clock in the morning. At 10:01, a wolf pup bit through the hem of his royal cloak. At 10:02, another poured a full jar of honey down the back of his left boot. At 10:03, 12 children convened an emergency vote on whether His Majesty's frightening face qualified him for the calm-down corner. James stood in the middle of the playroom with honey soaking slowly through one sock and a small brown-haired boy clinging to his cloak like a burr that had opinions. Across the room, 2 girls dumped a sack of flour over each other's heads and announced, with great solemnity, that a blizzard had struck Veldemere 3 months early. Will decided the inspection was proceeding exactly as poorly as he'd hoped. From beneath an overturned laundry basket near the hearth, his voice carried a warning not to move. James looked toward the basket. Only Will's boots and one outstretched hand were visible beneath its rim. "Are you trapped?" James asked. "I'm not. Cricket is—" Something inside the basket growled with the enormous menace of a creature, roughly the size of a loaf of bread. The king glanced down at the small fingers still fisted in his cloak and asked whose they were. "That's Robin," Will said. "He investigates things with his teeth. It's a phase. We're hoping." Robin released the fabric and tipped his face up. Dark curls, an expression of total innocence, ruined only by a thread of black wool caught between his front teeth. "I was checking if it was real," Robin explained. "Your verdict?" "Very expensive." The boy nodded, satisfied, as though this concluded important business. Will lifted the basket. A small silver-furred wolf shot out, skidded the length of the wooden floor on her belly, and vanished under the table. She wore one green sock knotted around her middle, and had a wooden spoon hopelessly tangled in her tail. "Cricket," Will said, in the tone of someone who had said this name many times before, "becoming a wolf does not excuse you from trousers." The pup sneezed from beneath the table. It did not count as a legal defense. Near the flower storm, a girl of 7 raised one flowery hand with great seriousness. She looked at present like the ghost of a baker who had died disapproving of something. "Does oppressive trousers wearing constitute an exception under the rules?" she asked. "Discuss it without biting anyone first, Wren?" James turned slowly, taking in the room the way he might survey a battlefield he had not been warned about. Sunlight slanted through mended curtains. The air smelled of honey, damp wool, wood smoke, and the faint, clean musk that clung to young shifters when their controls slipped. 12 children occupied the room in what appeared to be at least 14 locations at once. 2 had wolf ears poking through their hair. One boy had a tail working its way visibly through the seat of his trousers, to his evident dismay. Cricket remained entirely wolf, now stalking the spoon still attached to her own tail with murderous focus. Water dripped through a gap in the ceiling into 3 carefully positioned pots, one of which bore a paper sign reading "Not Sup." James had negotiated a border treaty with less preparation than this room demanded. Behind him, Captain Edmund Sorrel entered, took in the honey-soaked boot, the flower blizzard, and the boy still gripping the royal cloak, and asked very carefully whether he should secure the room. "Against whom?" Will asked, finally rising, his dark hair coming loose from its tie, a streak of flour crossing one cheekbone. Edmund watched Cricket attack her own tail with great seriousness. He withdrew the question for revision. James stepped forward. Every child froze. He wore no crown, but authority lived in the line of his shoulders, in something coiled and quiet beneath his skin, that even human children could sense the way animals sense weather. He let a thread of alpha power loose into the room. Enough! The word wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It fell over the room like the first cold shadow before a storm. The flower stopped midair. Robin dropped from the cloak. Cricket flattened under the table, ears pinned back so hard they nearly disappeared. 2 of the younger children whimpered. A boy's half-formed tail snapped back into his trousers so fast the seam tore. Will crossed the room before James had finished exhaling. "We do not frighten children into silence in this house." The king looked down at him, an Omega, unarmed, uncrowned, speaking to the strongest Alpha north of the Ember Sea, as though he'd tracked mud across a freshly scrubbed floor. Technically, he had. "They weren't listening," James said. "They were listening. They simply chose badly because you scared them into it. That's a distinction without a difference." "It is the entire difference," Will said, and crouched by the table instead of arguing further. He didn't reach for Cricket. He rested one open palm flat on the floorboards and waited until a small silver nose crept forward to sniff it. A boy of 8, Kit, self-appointed deputy manager of the nursery whenever the job involved giving orders rather than scrubbing bowls, marched up beside James. "Rule 4, Kit informed him. James, despite himself, gave the boy his full attention. "And what is Rule 4? Kit swallowed but held his ground. "Big feelings don't get to make small people scared." Silence. Then Robin climbed onto a chair and rapped a wooden spoon against the table like a gavel. "Vote," he announced. 11 hands went up. Cricket raised 2 paws. Wren counted with grave ceremony. 13 votes. There are 12 children," Edmund said carefully. "Cricket has 4 paws," Wren replied. "We only counted 2. That's restraint." The children escorted James to a corner beside the bookshelf, where a small painted chair sat beneath a hand-lettered sign. "Calm your body. Find your words. Do not lick the wall." The chair had been built for someone well under 4 feet tall. James looked at Will. Will looked at the chair. Edmund developed a profound interest in the ceiling leak. 2 minutes, Will said. "No alpha power allowed. I am the Alpha King of Veldemere." "Today," Will said, not unkindly, "you're also the person who frightened Cricket half out of her fur." "Sit, sit," James glanced beneath the table. The small wolf still lay flat, but her eyes tracked him now, wary and bright. He pulled off his ruined boot, crossed the playroom in one sock, and folded himself into the tiny chair, knees rising nearly to his chest, looking every inch like a man, surrendering the terms of a war he hadn't known he was fighting. Robin brought him a sand timer and instructed him, gravely, to consider his choices. Somewhere near the door, Edmund's shoulders began shaking before he'd even reached it. James returned from the chair and did what surprised Will most of everyone that day. He apologized properly. No royal caveat. No suggestion that his authority excused his volume. He crouched several feet from the table, well outside Cricket's space, and admitted, plainly, without performance, that his voice had been too frightening for a room full of children who had never once seen him before that morning. Cricket crept out, sniffed his outstretched hand, and licked one knuckle. Then she stole his remaining boot and dragged it under the table like treasure. Will watched James close his eyes in something between defeat and disbelief. "Progress," Will offered. "In which direction? Under review." It was there, in that small, unguarded moment, the king on his knees on a nursery floor in stocking feet, laughing despite himself at a wolf pup running off with his boot, that Will felt the first quiet crack in his certainty that this man was only a crown and a bad opinion about children. It came that afternoon, smaller and quieter than anyone watching would have guessed a turning point should be. Cricket, worn out from an entire morning of crime, fell asleep mid-stalk against James's knee in her small wolf shape, one ear twitching. Spoon still hopelessly knotted in her tail. James sat frozen, as though movement might shatter something. Will knelt to work the spoon free, fingers careful against fur, and their hands ended up close enough on the pup's small back that James's knuckles brushed his. Neither of them moved away first. "She trusts fast," Will said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. "Most of them do once the scary voice stops. No one has fallen asleep against me since I was a boy," James said. He said it plainly, without the polish he'd worn all morning, as though the words had slipped out ahead of his permission. "My mother used to let me fall asleep like this, against her side, in the evenings, before the crown mattered." He glanced down at the small silver weight against his knee. "I'd forgotten what it felt like, to be trusted with something soft." Will looked up at him properly then, not at the king, not at the crown he wasn't wearing, but at the tired, honest face of a man who had clearly spent a very long time being needed for his strength and never once for his gentleness. "You're not as bad at this as I hoped you'd be," Will admitted, for the record. "It would have been very satisfying to be right. I can still be terrible tomorrow, if it helps your case. Please don't." Cricket only just stopped biting people. Something warm passed between them, quick, unspoken, the kind of thing that arrives before either person has decided to let it. Will busied himself with the spoon. James stayed very still, careful not to wake the pup, and did not look away from Will's bent head for a long moment after the spoon was finally free. James inspected the kitchen the next morning. 3 cupboard doors refused to close. The stove smoked whenever the wind turned east. A shelf of chipped blue cups occupied the safest corner of the room, guarded like royal jewels. "Why is every cup blue?" James asked. Will retrieved his stolen boot from the bread box, where Cricket had generously added half a biscuit to it as rent. Cricket has opinions about cups. Green cups produce tears, hiding, and what I can only describe as an uprising. James wrote something on his inspection sheet. Will asked what? That we need more blue cups. Will studied him with new and genuine caution. "You're taking notes on cup colors." "I am taking this inspection seriously," James said, with the particular dignity of a man who had, 24 hours ago, publicly compared these children to dogs, and was now quietly ashamed of it. They toured the sleeping room next. 12 narrow beds, though 4 children preferred baskets on principle, and Cricket slept under Will's own desk whenever thunder rolled through. Boxes of spare clothes lined the wall, labeled in Will's careful hand. Robin outgrows everything in a week. Wren refuses anything with buttons. Kit will not admit he's outgrown his boots. "You know all of this," James said. "Not a question. It's my job to know all of this. It's more than a job." James turned to look at him fully, something searching in his gaze. "You know the shape of 12 children's fears and preferences, the way most people know their own reflection. That isn't duty. That's love, organized into a filing system." Will felt his face heat and pretended to reorganize a shelf that did not need reorganizing. "Don't let it go to my head. I still haven't forgiven you for the dog comment. I'm aware. I intend to spend the next 5 days making amends for it." 6, Will corrected. "You've already used one." James's mouth curved, the first real, unguarded smile Will had seen on him, and it did something unfair and immediate to the steadiness of Will's pulse. By mid-afternoon, a fresh disruption arrived at Thistledown's gate in the shape of Lord Aldrich Penrose, young, handsome in the deliberate way of men who practiced it, and entirely too interested in Will's welfare for someone who had never once visited before the king's public wager made the nursery fashionable gossip. "I heard His Majesty was slumming it here," Aldrich said, stepping past Edmund with the easy confidence of nobility, "and I simply had to see whether the caretaker survived intact." "He's very intact," Will said dryly. "Thank you for your concern." Aldrich took Will's flour-dusted hand and kissed it with theatrical care. "You look tired, William. You should let someone look after you for once." Behind them, a low sound rolled through the kitchen. Not quite a growl, more a pressure in the air, like the moment before thunder. Every cup on the blue shelf gave a faint, unified rattle. James had not moved from where he stood at the stove, inspection sheet still in hand, but something coiled and dangerous had gathered behind his eyes. "Careful with the hand," James said, pleasantly, in the voice of a man who was not being pleasant at all. "It's currently holding a very hot kettle." It was not, in fact, holding a kettle. Wren, passing through with an armful of laundry, paused to observe the scene with the clinical interest of a scholar. "Rule 4, she said thoughtfully, mostly to herself. "Big feelings." Aldrich sensibly released Will's hand. "I only meant to pay my respects," he said, retreating toward the door with considerably more haste than he'd arrived. "Do send word if the king proves insufficient to the task." The door shut. Silence settled, thick and awkward. "You broke a cup," Will observed, nodding toward the shelf, where one blue cup had in fact cracked clean through. "I'll replace it," you growled at a nobleman in my kitchen. "I did not growl." Cricket growled less menacingly at the laundry basket yesterday. James set down the inspection sheet with great and unnecessary care. "He had no business kissing your hand." "And you have business objecting to it?" Will asked, arching a brow, equal parts amused and unwilling to admit how much he'd enjoyed the small, possessive heat in James's voice. "I might," James said, quieter now, some of the temper draining into something more careful. "I find I mind it a great deal more than a king inspecting a nursery should." Will didn't have an answer ready for that. He busied himself sweeping up the broken cup instead, cheeks warm, and said nothing further, though he noticed, with some satisfaction he refused to examine too closely, that James watched him the rest of the afternoon like a man cataloging something he was afraid to lose. That evening brought a different kind of chaos, one Will had warned James about, and James had, predictably, not believed until he lived it. Bath time at Thistledown involved 2 tin tubs, 6 towels, 4 children who insisted on bathing in wolf form and shaking water across the entire room like small furious storms, and Robin, who had developed a philosophical objection to soap that he defended with the seriousness of a man arguing before a magistrate. "It removes my natural scent," Robin informed James, arms crossed, dripping onto the floorboards. "Your natural scent," James said, "currently resembles a wet dog who found a dead fish. That is my identity." Will, wringing out a towel nearby, did not bother hiding his laughter. "He says this every night. Hold firm. He caves after the second splash fight." James, to his own faint surprise, found himself negotiating with an 8-year-old over the moral philosophy of cleanliness with the same gravity he'd once brought to trade disputes with the Western Territories, and losing, twice before finally scooping Robin up under one arm, soap and all, to a great deal of shrieking delight. By the time all 12 were towelled, dried, and wrestled into nightclothes, James's shirt was soaked through, and his hair stood up in 6 directions, where small wet hands had styled it into what Wren generously called a very brave choice. Story time came after, all 12 pups piled onto cushions around the hearth, Cricket already half asleep in wolf form against Will's knee. James, invited, dared really, by Kit, to tell a story of his own, found himself recounting not a battle or a treaty but the first time he'd ever seen a wolf shift as a boy, how frightened and delighted he'd been in equal measure, how his brother had laughed at him for hiding behind their mother's skirts. "What happened to your brother?" Wren asked, with the blunt curiosity of the very young. The room quieted. Will's hand stilled on Cricket's fur, ready to redirect the question if James needed it redirected. James didn't need it redirected. "He died in a war I was too young to fight in," he said simply. "I think of him whenever I hear a wolf laugh, because he laughed exactly like one, loud and a little unkind, and I loved him anyway. Nobody flinched from it." Robin, without ceremony, simply leaned his head against James's arm, the way children do when a sad thing has been said honestly, and they don't yet know the etiquette of grief, but understand, instinctively, that closeness helps. Will caught James's eye across the firelight and didn't look away. Something passed between them. Not yet a confession, not yet anything either of them had words for, but a recognition, warm and quiet, of 2 people who had each spent years being strong for other people, and had just, for the length of one small story, allowed themselves to simply be soft instead. "Thank you," James said to him later, once the last pup had finally been carried to bed, "for a room where that story could be told without it becoming a weakness." "That's the whole of Thistledown," Will said. "Nothing here has to be a weakness, not even you." The morning began with a supply run, since Thistledown's flower stores had been tragically depleted by this week's improvised blizzard. James insisted on accompanying Will into the city himself over Edmund's strenuous objection that an unguarded Alpha King wandering a flower merchant's stall was a security incident waiting to happen. "I'll carry the flower," James said. "No one attacks a man carrying flower. It isn't dignified." The market, as it turned out, was where James Ashwood discovered that being recognized as the king mattered a great deal less than being recognized as Thistledown's king, a title the stallholders seemed to have already granted him, judging by the way the baker slipped an extra loaf into their basket for the little ones, and the butcher asked, with real concern, whether the roof repairs were coming along. "They know about the roof," James murmured, startled. "Everyone in this district knows about the roof. You're the only one who didn't, until a week ago." It was there, weaving between stalls with a sack of flour balanced on one shoulder, that they crossed paths again with Lord Aldrich Penrose, apparently in the market on business that seemed, upon reflection, entirely invented for the occasion. "William, twice in 1 week, I begin to suspect fate." Aldrich's gaze slid deliberately to the flour sack James carried. "Has the king been reduced to porterage? How the mighty entertain themselves," he volunteered, Will said evenly. "Did he?" Aldrich's smile turned sharper. "I only ask because I understand the council votes soon on Thistledown's future. It would be such a shame if His Majesty's hobby proved a passing amusement, and you were left holding rather more than a sack of flour." The air around James went very still, the particular stillness of a man deciding, with great effort, not to do something he'd regret. Will felt it before he saw it, a pressure at the edge of his senses, alpha power gathering like a held breath. "James," Will said quietly, resting one hand on his arm, not a command, simply a reminder. "Rule 4, James exhaled. The pressure eased, though his eyes didn't leave Aldrich's. "I don't make hobbies of things I intend to keep," he said, evenly enough, though something dangerous still edged the words. "Good day, my lord." They walked on in silence for a block before Will spoke. "You didn't growl. I wanted to. I noticed. So did half the fish stall. He implied I'd abandon you and the children the moment it became inconvenient." James's jaw was tight. "I find that harder to let pass than honey in my boot." Will glanced sideways at him, something warm unfurling beneath the irritation he was trying, and failing, to feel on Aldrich's behalf. "You didn't deny wanting to keep us." James looked down at him, surprised into stillness by his own words as much as Will's noticing them. "No," he said slowly, "I suppose I didn't." Neither of them said anything further about it, but the flour sack seemed to weigh a great deal less the rest of the walk home. Rain came from the east that night, which meant, by Thistledown's peculiar arithmetic, exactly 7 leaks instead of 9. James, now sleeping on a cot in the corner of the playroom by unanimous vote of the children, woke to the sound of Kit shouting that the roof over the sleeping room had given way entirely. What followed was chaos of an entirely different flavor than honey and flour. Real chaos, urgent and wet and frightened, water sheeted through a fist-sized gap in the plaster. 2 younger children cried. Cricket, startled from sleep, shifted halfway between girl and wolf and got tangled in her own blanket, panicking. James moved before he'd finished thinking. He hauled the heaviest wardrobe across the room to block the worst of the spray, scooped up 2 crying children in one arm like it cost him nothing, and knelt to free Cricket from her blanket with hands gentler than Will had ever seen a soldier's hands be. "I have you," he told her, voice low and steady beneath the storm noise. "I have you. It's all right." Will directed the older children to move bedding, calm and quick despite his own racing heart, and found himself, in the middle of it, simply watching James. Soaked to the skin, hair plastered to his forehead, a crying pup tucked safely against his chest, and thinking that this was a man who had spent his whole life being feared for his strength and had never once been shown what it was for. By the time the leak was dammed with buckets and an old tablecloth, the storm had passed, and the children, exhausted, had accumulated in a pile of blankets around James like he was simply the largest and warmest piece of furniture available. Will brought him tea near dawn and found him sitting against the wall, Cricket curled asleep in his lap, Robin snoring against one shoulder. "You didn't have to do all that," Will said softly, handing him the cup. "I wanted to." James looked down at the sleeping pup, and something unguarded crossed his face. "I don't think anyone's ever needed me like this, not the crown, not the army, just me, my arms, my voice quiet instead of loud." He looked up. "I like it, more than I expected to." Will sat beside him, close enough their shoulders touched, and didn't move away. "Rule 4 works both ways, you know. Big feelings don't have to be frightening. They can just be big." James turned his head. In the gray pre-dawn light, with rain still ticking softly off the eaves and 2 children dozing against him, he looked at Will like he was memorizing something. "I think mine might qualify," he said quietly. Will's breath caught. Neither of them moved for a long moment, close, warm, the air between them charged with something neither was quite brave enough to close the distance on. Not yet, not with an audience of sleeping children who would absolutely wake up and vote on it. Robin stirred against James's shoulder. The moment dissolved, gently, into morning. Midway through the fourth day, a knock at the gate brought a surprise neither of them had planned for. A new child, delivered by a tired village constable who introduced her simply as Hazel, 6 years old, recently orphaned when a fever took both her parents, discovered 3 days into an unplanned first shift that had left the whole village too frightened to keep her. She was small, dark-eyed, and said nothing at all, standing in the doorway, with her arms wrapped around herself, as though bracing for the door to shut again. Will crouched immediately, voice gone soft in the particular register he used only for the newest and most frightened arrivals. "Hazel, my name is Will, this is Thistledown. Nobody here is going to be frightened of you, I promise." Hazel didn't move. Her eyes slid, wary, to James, tall, broad-shouldered, unmistakably powerful even out of his crown, and something in her small frame went rigid with the particular fear of a child who has recently learned that grown men can be dangerous. James understood at once. He didn't approach. Instead, without a word, he lowered himself to sit directly on the floor of the entryway, folding his long legs beneath him, making himself smaller, slower, deliberately unthreatening in a way Will hadn't seen from him on the very first chaotic morning. "I get frightened of new places too," James said quietly, not looking directly at her. "When I was younger than you, I hid behind my mother's skirts the first time I saw someone shift. It's all right to be scared here. Nobody will rush you." Hazel watched him for a long moment. Then slowly, she crossed the room, not to James, but to Will, burying her face against his shoulder while keeping one wary eye on the king the whole way. It took the better part of the afternoon before she said her first word, "hungry," offered so quietly Will nearly missed it. It took until evening before she allowed James close enough to hand her a blanket without flinching. But by the time the other children swept her, cautiously and then completely, into their orbit, Wren appointing herself Hazel's official welcome committee, Robin solemnly offering to teach her his best biting technique for emergencies only, something in her small shoulders had begun, visibly, to unknot. James watched it happen with an expression Will hadn't seen on him before. Not the careful control of a king managing a room, but something rawer, quieter, almost reverent. "She'll be all right," Will said, coming to sit beside him once the newest arrival had finally been coaxed to sleep, curled between Wren and Cricket for safety. "I know," James said. "I only wish someone had told me that, the year I lost my brother. That grief doesn't have to be carried alone in a cold room. That there are houses like this one, if you know where to look." Will leaned his shoulder against his, quiet and steady. "There's a house like this one now. You built half its fence yourself this week." James huffed a soft, surprised laugh, and something in his face eased. "I suppose I did." Sir Percival Grey arrived unannounced, inspecting every chair for honey before he sat, and delivered his news with the flat satisfaction of a man who had been hoping for exactly this outcome. "The council votes in 3 days," he informed them, "on whether Thistledown's funding request proceeds. Given His Majesty's public wager, I imagine the outcome hinges rather heavily on whether he survives the week without." He glanced pointedly at James's still damp collar and the child currently attempting to braid his hair. "This." "He's doing well," Will said, before he could stop himself. Percival's eyebrows rose with interest. "Is he?" James, hair half-braided by Wren with the serious concentration of a royal appointment, did not dignify this with a response beyond a look that could have curdled milk. Percival's visit had come in the middle of what could only be described as a small domestic siege. Otto, 6 years old, round-cheeked, and the nursery's self-declared naval strategist whenever furniture was involved, had discovered that upside-down chairs made passable ship hulls, and had recruited 4 other children into a naval campaign across the playroom that required, for reasons no adult ever fully understood, that James serve as the enemy coastline. He'd spent 20 minutes being alternately boarded, defeated, and, upon Wren's ruling that coastlines could not simply surrender, annexed. It was in the middle of this campaign, James still valiantly playing conquered territory with Robin standing triumphantly on his chest, that Percival had arrived, inspected a chair for honey, found none, and sat down looking faintly disappointed by the omission. After Percival left, James turned to Will. "You defended me," I told the truth, You could have let him think I was drowning. It would have made your case easier. Will considered this and found, to his own mild surprise, that it hadn't even occurred to him. I don't want to win by lying about you, he said. I want to win because Thistledown deserves it. Those aren't the same thing, and I'd rather not confuse them. James studied him for a long moment, something warm and unguarded moving behind his eyes. You are, he said slowly, the most honest person I have ever argued with. Is that a compliment? It's terrifying, James said. I find I don't mind it. That same morning, in the quiet hours between breakfast and the chaos of lessons, James had asked Will to teach him something Will did every day without thinking about it: how to braid hair well enough that a child wouldn't complain about it by supper. It's not complicated, Will said, settling Wren onto a stool in front of them both, handing over a comb. 3 sections, over, under, over. Wren will critique you mercilessly if you get it wrong. I already know, Wren confirmed. James's first attempt came out lopsided, one side thicker than the other, and Wren examined it in a hand mirror with the withering expression of a woman twice her age. This looks like a badger built it. High praise, James said, undeterred, and tried again. His second attempt was better. His third, done with Will's hands guiding his from behind, a closeness neither of them commented on, though Will's pulse had climbed considerably by the time the braid was finished, earned a grudging nod of approval from its intended recipient. You're getting better, Will murmured, close enough that his breath stirred the hair at James's temple. I have excellent instruction, James said, not moving away. They stayed like that a moment longer than the braid required. James's hand still loosely holding Wren's hair, Will's hand still loosely holding his, the two of them close enough that Will could feel the warmth radiating off him, could hear the small catch in his breathing. Done, Wren announced, hopping off the stool before either of them had quite finished noticing each other, entirely unaware of the moment she'd interrupted. She admired her reflection once more and declared the braid acceptable for a king, which James seemed to consider the single greatest compliment of his reign. Later, once the lesson bell rang and the older children filed off to their letters, James found Will alone in the kitchen, sleeves rolled, kneading dough for the next day's bread with the same patient care he brought to everything at Thistledown. May I? James asked, nodding at the second lump of dough waiting on the counter. You'll get flour everywhere. I got honey everywhere on the first day. I've improved. He hadn't, particularly. His kneading technique was closer to a wrestling match than baking, but Will let him try anyway, correcting his grip now and then, laughing outright when James, flustered, sent a small cloud of flour across both their faces. You look like Wren did on day 1, Will said, wiping flour from James's cheek with his thumb, the touch lingering a beat longer than strictly necessary. James caught his wrist, gentle, before he could pull away. You keep doing that, he said quietly. Doing what? Touching me like it's nothing. Like it isn't the most anyone's touched me gently in years. His thumb traced briefly over the inside of Will's wrist. I don't want you to stop. I only wanted you to know I noticed. Will's breath went unsteady. Whatever he might have said back was lost to the sound of small feet thundering down the hall, and they broke apart, flour-dusted and smiling, moments before Kit burst in demanding to know whether bread counted as a science lesson. It happened in the garden, in the hour after the children had finally gone down for their nap, in the particular gold light of late afternoon that made even Thistledown's crooked fence look like something out of a painting. Will was mending a torn shirt on the back step. James sat beside him, sleeves rolled, hands blistered from 2 days of hauling roof timber that Will hadn't asked him to haul and hadn't been able to stop him from hauling anyway. You've ruined your hands, Will said, nodding at the raw skin across his palms. They'll heal. You're a king. You have people for this. I wanted to do it myself. James turned his hand over, considering the damage with something like satisfaction. I've spent my whole life being useful in ways that required other people to be afraid of me. I like this better. Being useful in a way that just requires effort. Will set the shirt aside without meaning to. You've changed since the first day. That first day I thought children were small, loud adults who needed correcting. James's gaze dropped briefly to Will's mouth, then back up, as though he hadn't quite meant to let it. I was wrong about a great many things, apparently. Such as assuming the person running this nursery would be easy to dismiss. His voice had gone low, quieter than the garden required. You are, I think, the least dismissible person I have ever met." The space between them had narrowed without either of them quite deciding to narrow it. Will could feel the warmth radiating off him, could see the small scar above his eyebrow that Wren had asked about 3 days ago with the particular bluntness of a 7-year-old, could see the exact moment James's gaze dropped to his mouth again and stayed there. "James." "Uncle James!" Kit's voice cracked across the garden like a slingshot. Cricket ate the map. They sprang apart with the guilty speed of soldiers caught out of formation. By the time Will reached the kitchen, Cricket sat proudly atop a half-shredded map of the royal roads, extremely pleased with herself, one corner still hanging from her jaw. Behind him, James let out a breath that was equal parts laugh and groan. "Rule 4, Will called over his shoulder, not quite hiding his own smile, does not cover attempted murder by paperwork." The days between Aldrich's second visit and the night on the back step were not, in fairness, entirely soft ones. There were hard hours, too, a fever that swept through 3 of the younger children and kept both Will and James awake past midnight, taking turns with cool cloths and quiet songs. A letter from the capital reminding James, in the dry language of court secretaries, that a kingdom did not run itself in his absence. A morning when Kit, overtired and overwhelmed by his self-appointed duties, snapped at a younger child and then burst into tears at his own unkindness, needing far gentler handling than any of the funnier chaos had required. James handled that morning particularly well, Will thought, watching him crouch to Kit's height instead of Kit's problem, saying nothing about rules or fault, simply asking what Kit needed right now, in this exact moment, before anything else got solved. "I didn't know that was a question you could ask a crying child," James admitted afterward, once Kit had been coaxed into a nap and a milder mood. "I always assumed you were meant to fix the crying first." "Sometimes the crying isn't the problem," Will said. "Sometimes it's the only honest thing happening in the room, and it deserves to finish before anyone tries to tidy it away." James turned that over for a long moment, the way he turned over most things Will said to him lately, slowly, thoroughly, as though testing the weight of an idea before deciding whether it could hold him. "You've never once tried to fix my crying," he said eventually, quiet. "The night of the storm. You just sat with it. You didn't cry the night of the storm." "I nearly did," James admitted. Watching that child come apart from fear, knowing my own voice had put fear like that into rooms before, in council chambers, on battlefields. I nearly did, and you never once looked at me like it made me smaller. "It didn't make you smaller," Will said simply. "It made you legible. There's a difference between a king who's never felt anything and a king who's felt everything, and learned, finally, what to do with it." James didn't answer that with words. He reached over, instead, and laced his fingers loosely through Will's on the tabletop between them. Not quite a declaration yet, not quite the kiss that would come a day later beneath the owl call and the blue-black sky, but close enough to it that Will's pulse remembered the moment for a long time afterward, the particular warmth of being chosen quietly, in the middle of an ordinary hard day, by a man who had finally stopped mistaking softness for weakness. It was a small moment. Thistledown specialized in those, the kind that never made it into a royal record or a council minute, the kind 2 people carried privately instead, folded away like a favorite letter, taken out and reread on quieter nights for the rest of a very long life together. Day 6, what he'd never said. That evening, with the children finally asleep and the house gone quiet in the particular way old buildings go quiet, settling, ticking, breathing, Will found James on the back step again, looking up at a sky, gone the deep blue-black of a Veldemere autumn night. "May I sit?" "You built half this bench yourself. I'd hardly stop you." Will sat. For a while neither spoke. An owl called somewhere past the mended fence. "I never wanted to be Alpha King," James said eventually, quiet, as though the dark made the confession easier. "My brother did. He wanted it his whole life. The councils, the borders, the weight of it. I wanted to breed horses and be left alone. Then the war took him, and it took my father the winter after, and I inherited a crown built for someone else's shoulders." Will didn't offer easy comfort. He simply listened, the way he'd learned to listen to 13 children who each needed something different from silence. "I built a version of myself that could carry it," James went on. "Stern, certain, frightening, when frightening was useful. I forgot there was another version underneath, until a nursery caretaker told a council full of nobles that raising children takes more than housebreaking a dog." He glanced sideways, something rueful and fond in the look. "You didn't just win an argument, William. You reminded me I used to be a person before I became a crown." Will's chest ached with something too large for the small garden to hold. "I didn't do that. You did that. I just gave you a room loud enough that you couldn't out-argue it. You gave me children who trust me because I stopped being frightening," James said. "You gave me a place where being gentle wasn't a weakness to hide. I don't know how to thank you for that." "I'm not certain thank you covers it." "What would cover it?" Will asked, softer than he meant to. James turned to face him fully. In the dark, his eyes were steady, unguarded in a way Will hadn't seen from him even in the garden that afternoon. "May I be honest with you? Recklessly, unroyally honest? I think you've been building to it for 3 days." "I stayed because of a foolish wager about soldiers and dogs," James said. "Then I stayed because 13 children needed someone steady. Somewhere between the honey in my boot and the calm-down chair and cricket eating my map, I started staying for you. I don't know when it happened. I only know I am no longer counting down these 7 days. I am dreading their end." The garden went very quiet. Somewhere inside, a floorboard creaked. One of the children, probably, checking on the noise, though neither of them turned to look. "I've been telling myself it's just because you're good with the pups," Will admitted, voice barely above the owl's call. "That it's easier to like a king who kneels in a tiny chair and apologizes properly, but it isn't just that. I like the way you ask questions instead of assuming. I like that you took notes on cup colors. He stopped, throat tight. "I like you." Which is enormously inconvenient, considering you're the Alpha King of Veldemere, and I run a nursery with 7 leaks and a fence made partly of a church pew. "I find," James said, leaning in, slow enough that Will could have stopped him and didn't, "that I don't mind inconvenient." Their mouths met, soft, brief, tasting faintly of the mint tea Will had made an hour before, careful in the way of 2 people equally afraid of ruining something new. When they parted, James's forehead rested against his, both of them breathing like they'd run somewhere instead of simply sat still. "That," Will whispered, "was extremely against nursery policy. I'll accept the calm-down chair as punishment. You'd fit better in it now. You've lost weight running after 13 pups." James laughed, real, warm, unguarded, and kissed him again, and this time neither of them worried at all about who might be watching from the window. Someone was, several someones in fact, in matching nightclothes, already whispering about what this meant for the scoring committee. Sleep did not come easily to Will that night, though it should have. The 7th day loomed close enough to touch, the roof finally sound, the council vote 3 days off, but suddenly, improbably, no longer the thing keeping him awake. What kept him awake was the memory of James's mouth against his, soft and searching, and the harder truth underneath it, that in 6 days, a man he'd meant to outlast had instead quietly rearranged the shape of his life. He found James in the kitchen near midnight, unable to sleep either, sitting at the scarred table with a cup of cooling tea and cricket, asleep across his boots in wolf form, having apparently declared him furniture sometime in the last hour. "You should be resting," Will said, though he pulled out the chair across from him anyway. "So should you." James turned his cup slowly between his blistered hands. "I keep thinking about tomorrow. Not the committee. Wren's committee will do what it likes regardless of anyone's preparation. I keep thinking about after. About what happens to this," he gestured vaguely, at the space between them, at the sleeping pup, at the whole quiet house. "Once the wager is settled and I no longer have an official reason to be here." "You could invent one," Will said. "You're the king. Kings invent reasons for things constantly. I've read your inspection sheets. You once wrote 3 pages on cup colors." "I could," James agreed, the corner of his mouth lifting. "But I find I'd rather not have to invent anything. I'd rather simply be asked to stay, honestly, by someone who wants me here for reasons that have nothing to do with wagers or roofs or committees." Will's chest tightened, warm and aching all at once. "James Ashwood. Are you fishing for an invitation?" "Shamelessly. You already have one." Will reached across the table, covering one of his ruined, blistered hands with his own. "You've had one since the night of the storm, if I'm honest. I was only waiting to see if you'd stay long enough to notice." James turned his hand over beneath Will's, lacing their fingers together, something unguarded and grateful crossing his face. "I noticed the moment Cricket fell asleep against my knee," he admitted. "I simply didn't trust it yet. I've been wrong about what I wanted before. I didn't want to be wrong about this. "And now," James said, lifting Will's hand to press a soft kiss to his knuckles. "I have never been more certain of anything, including my own name." They sat like that a long while, hands joined across the table, Cricket snoring softly over James's boots, the house creaking gently around them in the particular contented way of old buildings full of sleeping children, until at last tiredness won out, and they climbed the stairs together, pausing at the landing where their paths diverged, reluctant, smiling, already counting the hours until morning. The final day was not orderly. Breakfast burned because Robin asked James with total sincerity whether a king could legally adopt a goat. Cricket got stuck in a jumper 2 sizes too small. Kit attempted to supervise the roofers and was gently redirected 4 times. A pot of blue paint tipped over a windowsill, staining one wall and most of Otto a cheerful shade of cornflower. James no longer tried to eliminate the chaos. He moved through it, rescued the breakfast, cut Cricket free of the jumper, gave Kit an actual measuring task to make him feel useful, let Otto keep one small blue handprint on the wall because the boy had asked so hopefully. Will watched the difference and understood it completely. On the first day, James had believed success meant making the children quiet. Now he understood success meant hearing what each kind of noise required. The 7-day challenge ended with supper laid out in the garden. Lanterns hung along the mended fence. Fresh bread and roast chicken filled the evening air with warm, savory steam. The children sat cross-legged on blankets, since the tables had been given over to roofing supplies. Edmund attended in full uniform. 2 of the roofers stayed on after work, unpaid, simply for the bread. Even Sir Percival Grey came, inspecting each chair for honey before finally cautiously sitting. James rose and lifted his cup. "Thistledown Nursery," he announced, "will remain open." The children cheered. Its roof will no longer admit weather. Louder cheering. Its fence will discourage unsupervised expeditions. The cheering weakened considerably. And William Hart retains full and permanent authority over its rules, its care, and its breakfast. The children howled with delight. Will looked at James across the lantern light, throat tight. He had given the nursery resources without taking ownership of it. Powerful men so often called control help. James had learned the difference and given him the one gift that mattered more than gold. Trust left fully in Will's hands. "The inspection is complete," James said. Wren stood. "No, it isn't." She produced a folded sheet of paper that Will recognized, with mounting horror as the same paper she'd been hiding from him for 2 days. "Wren, we require transparency," she said, with the gravity of a magistrate, and climbed onto a garden stool. Robin stood beside her as assistant announcer. Cricket, in wolf form, sat at their feet, tail sweeping the grass. "Alpha King James Ashwood," Wren announced, "has completed the husband suitability inspection." The roofers went very still. Sir Percival looked positively delighted to have witnessed this. James did not move. Wren read the results. He had passed cake sharing, though his portions had been insultingly small. He had overpassed toy repair, having rebuilt a wooden horse so thoroughly it would survive several generations of pups. He'd earned full marks for temper control, protecting the family, remembering blue cups, and, the children agreed unanimously, making Will laugh. His wolf form, tested during a brief supervised run 2 days prior, received 9 points out of 10. "Why 9?" James asked, finding his voice. "You turned too fast and threw Otto into a hedge," Robin explained. "He was holding my tail." "The test included movement," Wren said, unmoved. "The final category concerns whether the king will remain, even when things become difficult." 13 hands went up. Cricket barked. 14, Wren corrected. James looked at Will. Heat climbed into Will's face. "I did not authorize this committee. He tried to stop it," Kit reported helpfully. "We overruled him. That's Rule 4's cousin. Big feelings need honest committees." "There's one test remaining," Robin announced, with the terrible confidence of a child who has been waiting all week to say this sentence. Everyone knew what it was. No one rescued Will from it. "You have to kiss him," Robin said. Will briefly considered the merits of relocating to a distant kingdom under a false name. James rose instead of approaching him immediately. He crossed to the committee and knelt in the grass before them, at their eye level, the way Will had taught him to do that first terrible morning. "You don't choose a husband for Will," he told them gently. 12 small faces fell. "He chooses, and I haven't asked him yet." Will's embarrassment softened all at once into something far warmer. James crossed the grass and stopped in front of him. close enough that the lantern light caught every uncertain, hopeful line of his face. "I stayed because of a foolish claim about soldiers," he said, quiet enough that it belonged only to the two of them, though every child present strained to hear it anyway. "Then I stayed because this family needed someone steady. Somewhere between the honey in my boot and the chair built for someone half my size, I began staying for you. I can't live here every day. I have a kingdom that turns creative the moment I look away, but I want to keep coming back. I want to know this family. I want the chance to know you beyond leaking roofs and stolen boots." Will held his gaze, chest full to overflowing. "Are you asking permission to court me?" "Yes. You survived 7 days, barely. Your toy repair lacked proportion." James spread his ruined, blistered hands in mock defense. "That horse will outlive us both. And your breakfast system was a disaster." "I withdrew it," James said, the moment Robin proposed goat adoption as an alternative. Will smiled, slow, certain, the smile of a man who had spent 7 days falling and had finally stopped pretending otherwise. "Then you may try," the children erupted. "The kiss," Robin bellowed, as though announcing a jousting match. James looked at Will, waiting, giving him the choice the way he'd promised the committee he would. Will closed the last of the distance himself, caught the front of his coat, and kissed him. Brief, warm, gentle enough to make him forget, for one entire second, that 13 children were watching with the focused intensity of a war council. Then the garden exploded into cheering loud enough to wake the roofer's dog 3 streets over. Cricket shifted mid-howl into a small, delighted, entirely naked child, which Kit solved by throwing a napkin over her, which solved nothing. Otto knocked over his cup. Wren wrote past across the bottom of her paper in enormous letters. Edmund applauded exactly once, with great dignity. Sir Percival checked, quite seriously, whether kissing had been budgeted for anywhere in the roofing estimate. James rested his forehead against Will's, laughing softly. "Is every private moment in this house supervised?" "Every single one. I should have asked about that before approving your open floor plan." James's promise in the garden had been just that, a promise, made as a man and not yet as a king with the Treasury's signature behind it. The council still had to make it law. The vote, 3 days later, was barely a formality, though it did not feel that way to Will, sitting in the gallery above the chamber with his hands knotted tightly in his lap, watching the man he loved stand before 11 nobles who had spent a lifetime believing softness and strength could not occupy the same crown. James did not bring notes. He did not need them. "A week ago," he told the council, "I compared raising children to housebreaking a dog in this very room in front of most of you. I was wrong, and I intend to spend a great deal longer than 7 days making up for it." He looked up briefly to where Will sat, and something steadied in his voice. "I have led armies. I have negotiated treaties that kept this kingdom from war 3 times over. I tell you honestly, none of it taught me as much about what leadership requires as 1 week spent failing gently in front of 13 children who forgave me for it anyway. A kingdom that cannot make room for its softest citizens has already lost something no treaty can win back." Sir Percival, to his own visible surprise, found himself without a single figure to argue. Thistledown's funding passed without objection, doubled in fact, over Will's original request, a fact Percival grumbled about for exactly as long as it took Wren to hand him a slice of cake at the celebration supper that evening, after which he pronounced the whole arrangement fiscally sound on reflection. The roof stopped leaking by the 2nd month. The fence, rebuilt properly, no longer discouraged only wandering pups but also, to everyone's mild disappointment, the tunnel-digging enterprise that had briefly relocated to the vegetable patch instead. James visited every Wednesday and Saturday. Without fail, Crown left at the palace gate. He kept a mug on Thistledown's shelf, a spare shirt in the wardrobe, and a chair of his own beside the yellow calm-down seat, which the children had painted king across the back. Robin had added, in smaller letters underneath sometimes. 10 months later, on a bright spring afternoon, James Ashwood lay stretched in wolf form beneath the apple tree behind Thistledown, his great black tail curled protectively around a small silver pup dozing against it. Robin and Otto were constructing a fortress out of twigs beside his front paws. Wren sat cross-legged on his back, revising a document with the terrible concentration of someone drafting treaty language. Will crossed the garden with a jug of lemonade and found the scene, as he so often did lately, entirely too fond to interrupt right away. "What are you writing?" he asked eventually. Ren attempted, unsuccessfully, to hide the page. Will took it instead. Housebreaking reinspection, the header read, in Ren's most official handwriting. James lifted his great wolf head. I already passed. Husbands require regular reinspection. Ren informed him, with the confidence of a girl who had clearly appointed herself chief auditor of the household. Standards may have slipped. Have they slipped? James asked, directing this at Will with the particular wounded dignity of a man who had spent the last 10 months learning to braid hair and had grown genuinely proud of it. Your standards are excellent, Will said. Ask me again after you've told them when the wedding is. Kit, passing with an armful of laundry, dropped it entirely. When is the wedding? Will very nearly dropped the lemonade. James, still a wolf, pressed both front paws over his eyes with the long-suffering air of a man who had, admittedly, proposed rather privately 3 weeks prior and had not yet found a moment quiet enough to make the announcement without an audience of 13. The silver pup woke, shifted halfway into a small human shape without bothering to finish the job, and climbed directly onto James's head to get a better view of the commotion. 13 children produced, with alarming speed, fresh scoring sheets. There isn't a date yet, Will admitted, laughing despite himself, sitting down in the grass against James's warm, familiar shoulder. We were going to tell you properly. At supper, with cake. Cake sharing is a scored category, Ren reminded him. I remember, James said, muffled, from beneath his paws. Will leaned his head against sun-warm black fur and let the noise of the garden settle around him, hammering from whatever unauthorized tunnel Otto and Kit had started that morning. Ren narrating wedding inspection categories to an audience of increasingly excited pups, the small, pleased weight of a silver-haired child perched triumphantly on the king's skull. You said 12 pups would be easy, Will murmured, just for James. A long, deeply put-upon sigh rumbled through James's chest. Will laughed and pressed a kiss to the fur near his ear. For the record, I never once said marrying you would be. James's tail thumped once, contentedly, against the grass. That evening, once the fortress had been abandoned, the tunnel filled back in under protest, and 13 exhausted children finally settled into their beds, some in beds, 4 on principal in baskets. One small silver-furred girl curled beneath Will's desk out of long habit, even though the thunder had long since passed. James found Will on the back step where it had all properly started, mending another torn shirt in the gold spill of lantern light. They've already planned the wedding cake, James said, settling beside him. 3 flavors. Ren has drawn a seating chart. Robin has requested the goat attend as a witness. Naturally. I love you, James said, simply, the way he said most true things now, without ceremony, without the armor he'd worn the day he'd first walked into this crooked, leaking, wonderful house and called children dogs. I loved you before I understood what I was staying for. I love you a great deal more now that I do. Will set the mending aside and let himself be pulled close, head tucked beneath James's chin, the whole warm, noisy weight of their family settling to sleep around them. I love you too, he said, even though you still can't turn wolf without nearly clearing a hedge. 9 out of 10, James reminded him, mouth curved against his hair. I've been promised the last point is negotiable. A small shadow crossed the doorway before either of them noticed her. Hazel, 10 months steadier than the frightened girl who'd once flinched from James's shadow, now perfectly at ease, padding barefoot across the kitchen in her nightshirt. Couldn't sleep? Will asked, shifting to make room on the step. Hazel climbed up between them without being invited, the way she'd learned to do only in the last few months, as though the right to simply belong somewhere had finally stopped feeling like something she needed permission for. Ren said you're getting married, she said. I wanted to ask something before the others make it official and put it on a form. That sounds ominous, James said. Hazel considered her words with the same grave care she brought to everything, small and precise. When you get married, do I still get to call you both mine, or does that change? The question landed soft and enormous all at once. Will felt James go very still beside him. Nothing changes, James said gently, once he'd found his voice again. Except now there are 2 of us instead of 1, standing between you and anything that ever tries to frighten you again. Rule 4, Hazel said, satisfied, as though this settled the matter permanently, and tucked herself under Will's arm the way Cricket tucked herself under blankets during thunder, not because she was afraid anymore, but because she'd learned, at last, That warmth was something she was allowed to ask for. James reached over and rested one broad, blistered hand briefly against the crown of her head, careful in the way of a man who had learned gentleness the hard way and intended to keep practicing it for the rest of his life. Above them, the lanterns strung along the mended fence swayed gently in the night air. Somewhere past the garden wall, the city of Veldemere slept on, unaware that its Alpha King had spent the evening losing an argument about hair braiding to a 7-year-old and winning, without even realizing it, the only argument that had ever truly mattered. They were married that autumn, in Thistledown's garden, rather than the palace chapel James's advisors had assumed would host it, a decision that had taken exactly one sentence from Will to settle. The children should be able to attend without wearing shoes they hate. The fence, freshly painted, was strung with lanterns and late-season roses. Cricket served, at her own insistence, as ring-bearer in wolf form, which meant the rings arrived at the altar roughly 4 minutes late and slightly damp. Robin gave a toast no one had authorized, in which he informed the assembled nobility that His Majesty had once been sentenced to the calm-down chair and had, in Robin's professional opinion, turned out all right considering. Wren presented both grooms with a final scoring sheet before the vows, on which every category had already been marked, in her careful hand, passed permanently. Sir Percival, seated near the front, was seen dabbing his eyes with a handkerchief he later claimed was simply dusty. When James knelt to kiss his husband in front of the whole crooked, beloved, thoroughly unauthorized wedding committee, the cheer that went up nearly startled the roof tiles loose all over again. Though this time, for once, nobody minded a bit of chaos. Even Edmund, who had spent 7 years perfecting the art of the single dignified clap, was seen laughing outright, uniform buttons undone, a slice of cake balanced precariously on one knee. The evaluation, unfortunately for the Alpha King, had only just begun. He found rather happily that he didn't mind that at all.